Andy Burnham has seemingly united the Labour Party.
We can be that party, the party that puts more power in people's hands, all people and all places, public and private sectors, in a new sense of unity and common cause.
But inside Downing Street, he can't keep being all things to all people.
Andy Burnham is still kind of in the place where he's having his cake and eating it. He's saying he wants to be all things to all people whilst being distinctively Andy Burnham.
That's my mission as your new leader, to bring back hope.
It's not quite clear what sacrifices he is willing to make.
And this is why.
From here, we do it differently. We win by being us. Boldly, confidently, authentically us. Labour, that's how we win. I want people to understand the thinking behind the political direction I set, so people can see the decisions we take and the reasons why. I am clear, Britain took a series of wrong turns in the 1980s. Political power was centralised and economic power was privatised. The country surrendered control of the essentials: housing, water, energy, transport, and left people exposed to higher costs.
Andy Burnham there, promising a rather different type of politics as he was formally confirmed as Labour leader. On Monday, he will be the next Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, completing one of the more remarkable political comebacks of recent years. Because 10 years ago, frankly, Burnham looked like a man whose moment had passed. He'd served as a minister in the governments of Gordon Brown. He'd had 2 cracks at the leadership, both of which failed, and he was preparing to leave Westminster altogether. But it was in Greater Manchester that he finally became the politician he'd struggled to be nationally. Visible, emotionally fluent, fiercely regional, and apparently rather more certain about what he believed. And there is the problem, or perhaps we should say test. It is rather easier to embody several different, perhaps even competing versions of Labour from Manchester than it is from behind the big desk in Downing Street. So, who exactly is Andy Burnham? What is this Manchesterism that he wants to bring to the rest of the UK? And when the difficult decisions start having to be taken, just how different will he really be from Sir Keir Starmer? Aubrey Allegretti is the chief political correspondent of The Times. Aubrey, great to have you with us on This Is Why, your debut performance, and what a day, I suppose, to do it. But look, before we look forward, you've got to first look back. Andy Burnham, I mean, who is he? What in his upbringing made it a necessity that he would end up as a Labour politician and indeed in a couple of days a Labour Prime Minister?
Yeah, Andy Burnham's been on a very long path to this moment when you consider that his first leadership bid stretches back 16 years ago and that he's been an MP going back even further than that. He was born in one of the sort of Liverpool suburbs of Aintree, but his father, a telephone engineer, took a post in Manchester, which is why he's sort of hailed as being sort of more associated and from there rather than Merseyside. And he's obviously spoken about some of his big political heroes in the past, being people like Neil Kinnock and Margaret Beckett, who represented sort of big in post-industrial towns in the north. And it's really sort of through trying to champion those areas that he's earned this moniker as the King of the North. He had served as an MP for some time, including his cabinet as Health Secretary. And we know that that's driven a lot of his frustration with one of the big policy areas that he's talked about wanting to grapple with, which is social care. He's also, of course, been a sort of big leading figure as a Metro mayor. So he's had quite a lot of pronouncements on Labour in opposition and in government as well. He has the sort of benefit of both, therefore, being outside of the tent and being able to kind of criticise it with some detachment without taking responsibility for the national government's policies, whilst also having been a figure sort of closely associated with the party.
Take us back to that time when he was a Member of Parliament, and specifically when he was a minister in both Blair and Brown's governments. How was he viewed back then? Because I recall him as being popular, well-liked, but not necessarily considered the most heavyweight of the new Labour politicians.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he was effectively a government loyalist and rewarded with a series of promotions. He is somebody who's been sort of, I suppose, criticised for twisting in the wind politically. He made reference to that in his first speech as Labour leader today. He didn't quite explicitly mention the joke, but it went that there is a sort of Blair-ite, a Brownite, a Corbynite, and a Milibandite who all walk into a bar and the barman says, "Hello, Andy, what are you having?" in reference basically to how his political allegiances seemed to switch depending on the leader that he was working under at the time. And in some ways, that was an effective political strategy. It meant that he did remain at the top end of the Labour Party for quite a long time. But it was in 2017, really, when Labour seemed to be consigned to the wilderness years under Jeremy Corbyn, that he left and decided that he'd be able to exercise much more power as the mayor of Greater Manchester, which he has done to relatively good effect. It's seen a massive sort of business boom there. There's been lots of investment and growth as well. Manchester's sort of outpaced lots of other regions in the country. And so it's that kind of micro success, not to diminish the importance of the area, but it's that success in that sort of regional area that Burnham is now trying to replicate on a much larger scale.
As you say, he certainly, around the time 2015, 2016, struggled to define himself politically. But, certain events seem to have shaped him quite fundamentally, and one of those was Hillsborough. Just explain that.
Certainly. So, I mean, Andy Burnham has been a big campaigner for the Hillsborough families, and it was he working actually with Keir Starmer in, I think, 2017, who both tried to draft an original version of the Hillsborough Law, which effectively placed a duty of candour on public officials to tell the truth. That was obviously because in the aftermath of the Hillsborough disaster, there were multiple cover-ups and state failures that compounded the wait for justice that families of the 97 victims had to face. And he sort of tried to make it his raison d'etre. And Keir Starmer almost sort of picked this up when he became Prime Minister. It was, if you like, one of his biggest passion projects, which was facing real threat by the end of his leadership not to have become law, because the campaigners and victims' families felt that it didn't go far enough. So there was real concern. And Andy Burnham had been effectively sort of on these campaigners' side, saying that the bill wasn't tough enough. And he worked with Keir Starmer behind the scenes over the last couple of weeks to try and get it into a place where it was acceptable to the families. And that was where we heard the first contribution of Andy Burnham from then the backbenches, where he was talking about how he'd been working with Keir Starmer to try and make this law become into statute. It hasn't yet got there, but it is probably the one piece of shared common ground that Andy Burnham and Keir Starmer have, given there's been quite a lot of bitterness between them over the last few months.
What about his personal beliefs? I mean, Andy Burnham is Catholic. I mean, he says that he isn't particularly religious, but that the teachings of the church, the social teachings, kind of underpin his politics. I mean, do you see any evidence of that?
Absolutely. I mean, we obviously learnt from Tony Blair's government when Alistair Campbell famously said, we don't do God, that sometimes there is a sort of reticence on behalf of voters to see religion mixed up in politics. And you haven't often seen prime ministers that keen to talk about their faith. And there's been, sometimes an effort to kind of bring the state and religion together in a way that is quite unique in sort of international comparisons, considering the UK is, I think, one of only 2 countries in the world which has spaces in its legislature reserved for members of the state religion, those being the bishops that sit in the House of Lords. I think the only other country where that's the case is Iran, where they have clerics. But I think people like a politician who has sort of deep personal feelings and a story to tell. And in Andy Burnham's case, anything that he can do to sort of show that he's got a grounding that goes beyond the political makes him more distinctive and it makes him more believable. So I wouldn't be surprised if we hear more about that.
Take us to Manchester and his time as mayor of Greater Manchester. I mean, from there, we've heard it called, well, a couple of things, Burnhamism, Manchesterism. Do you see a coherent governing philosophy or just a handy catch-all for all the things that Andy did whilst he was mayor?
I mean, you speak to different people and you get variations of those different answers. So on the one hand, they say you have somebody who was became a real sort of figurehead, not just for the city, but that's how he earned his sort of moniker, the King of the North. They point to the sort of huge attention that he got during the COVID pandemic when he was sort of fighting against the almost sort of top-down kind of imposition and the frustrating lack of financial support that was being given to places in the tier that Manchester was put into. They say that he earned this slogan that he campaigned on, "Our Andy, he's for us." But then there are lots of critiques from the other side of the spectrum of people who say that actually what he did was sort of allow huge development in Greater Manchester, which kind of brought in lots of private investments, but with relatively sort of little public return, and that he's been able to reap the economic rewards and benefits of something that was already starting to happen in the UK. So between those two things, he's got to now navigate how he can change Manchesterism into something that befits the whole country. Because you even hear it from MPs who say there are lots of rural seats that Labour picked up at the last general election who are concerned that he's going to, if you like, sort of forget that there are large pockets of poverty and deprivation in the south. That includes in the southwest. So he's still got a lot of convincing people to do that he can be at all regions and nations in the UK.
Yeah, just in terms, though, of the successes, I mean, what's your assessment, Aubrey, of how much of that was down to him? Undoubtedly, Andy Burnham has been a remarkable cheerleader for Manchester. But the thing about cheerleaders is they stand at the side of the pitch and they don't tell the players what to do. That's someone else's job. And I'm just wondering if there might be an analogy in there.
I genuinely think he's got a sort of record to be proud of insofar as the economic growth of Manchester has far outstripped a lot of other regions in the UK. And he's also done it with a sort of relatively small political team. He was a real sort of figurehead who led Greater Manchester through the sort of economic boom that it's been through. I think when you look back to one of his Greater Manchester mayoral campaigns, he won literally every single ward in Greater Manchester. And so that was a recognition of the fact that there was a sort of real deep respect, affinity, maybe love is going a little bit too far, from people that just felt like he was on their side. That's what he is trying to replicate. It's not just about the economic successes. It's about giving people the hope and the belief that you are the person that is standing up for them, that has been missing on the sort of national political stage that he has managed to cultivate quite uniquely on a regional level.
Andy Burnham is now leader of the Labour Party and will shortly be Prime Minister. And one of the first jobs you've got to do and got to get right is assemble your cabinet. Now, there has been furious speculation about who is going to end up where around that cabinet table. But as I read it, I mean, no one's got anything definitive on who's going to be around the cabinet table yet, have they?
That's right. I mean, I think to a certain extent that is because these plans are still taking shape, and it is yet to be seen whether or not this is all some fantastic kind of sleight of hand whereby Andy Burnham's very small cadre of advisors have managed to keep this information to themselves. And Andy Burnham was at great pains on Friday morning to say in his speech, "There is a plan, I am ready," or whether actually it will betray a sort of real rushness on behalf of Burnham and his allies, who thought that they might have the whole of summer in order to assemble their team, have much more thorough access talks with the civil service to start to try to prime them for what they wanted to do, how and when. And that, I think, is still yet to be seen. But undoubtedly, there are big sort of political battles going on behind the scenes. And Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, seems to be being touted as the most likely contender for Chancellor. Andy Burnham's allies say that they have successfully kind of killed off the idea that Ed Miliband could go into the Treasury to replace Rachel Reeves, who is obviously seen as being much more from the left of the party. He's a big sort of ideologue who has big, grand ideas about rewiring the state and potentially even sort of reshaping how the fiscal rules work in practice, even if he's not rewriting them. Whereas Shabana Mahmood is somebody who is seen as much more sort of steady as she goes, who won't necessarily disrupt a lot of the what's called Treasury orthodoxy, and potentially could be much more pugnacious on things like benefit cuts.
I mean, does Burnham start with a blank sheet of paper, or does he have to keep some of the old guard within the cabinet?
There are kind of two tiers within the cabinet when we're talking about this big rush for jobs. There's the four main posts known as the Great Offices of State, which are Prime Minister and Chancellor, and then there will be a balancing act. So if Ed Miliband doesn't get the role of Chancellor, is the sweetener for him to be made Foreign Secretary, which in and of itself, I think, could cause problems. I've already heard some unhappiness from Labour MPs over the last few days who are frustrated, for example, recalling his stance on not joining David Cameron in backing airstrikes in Syria when Ed Miliband was leader of the opposition back during the coalition government. Then there's the role of Home Secretary, which Yvette Cooper, who's the current Foreign Secretary, might be favoured for if, again, Shabana Mahmood moves out of that post. Once you've cleared those sort of big four offices of state, then it's a bit easier to sort of see where the lie of the land is. Wes Streeting, who had previously been touted for one of those big roles, some of his allies think that he might just return to being Health Secretary. Ditto Heidi Alexander, a big fan of Andy Burnham's, who was a cabinet minister calling for Keir Starmer to go and for that transition. Well, she could go back to being Transport Secretary as well. And then you've got people like Angela Rayner, who were only pushed out of the cabinet in September last year over unpaid stamp duty. Well, she's eyeing up a return to Housing Secretary. So it could in some ways sort of look and feel quite similar, especially when you consider that people like Louise Haigh and Lucy Powell, who were both also forced to leave their jobs, well, they also want to return to the cabinet. So it's not clear that actually the sort of top is going to look that different, even if it does feel different.
I mean, he says that he's not going to punish MPs for having differing opinions. You know, he says that he can bring an end to factionalism. But I mean, given how many Labour leaders we've seen go over factionalism over the years, do you think he stands a chance?
I think it's a bit rich, frankly, of Andy Burnham to have sort of sat there and said that now is the moment for the party to pull together, because
after he's just stabbed Keir Starmer in the back.
You just hear from so many of Keir Starmer's supporters that they felt undermined from him on so many occasions, and at really sort of excruciating, embarrassing moments, particularly party conference in 2025, which is when the media's attention is sort of most heightened and looking for critics of the leader. And they also feel as though, even if it wasn't Andy Burnham directly, then a lot of his outriders have been doing this for some time. Louise Haigh, the former Transport Secretary, who's now tipped to serve as Chancellor of the Duchy's Lancaster, which is effectively the most senior cabinet office minister sitting at the kind of nexus of all the government departments. She said in an interview a couple of weeks ago that they had effectively been planning for this eventuality for a year. Now, that could be a recognition that the writing was on the wall for Keir Starmer and trying to sort of try and find a way through under a new leader. But Keir Starmer's critics, I think, would say, well, that just proves that there has always been a sort of faction or a rump of the Labour Party that's been working against us. And I know so many Labour MPs are really sort of bitter, frustrated and unhappy at Keir Starmer's ending. One or two of them have even said to me, you know, we are not averse to challenging Andy Burnham himself in future. Like, I think that is very low likelihood, but it speaks to just how frustrated and angry they are.
What then will be his priorities as soon as he gets the keys to number 10? I mean, clearly he wants to be distinct from the Keir Starmer government that went before him. So possibly not straight out of the gate, you know, raising taxes.
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, when you think back to July 2024, so many of the mistakes that Labour is accused of making now related to the sort of pessimism with which they came into office, talking about the £22 billion black hole and that filling up basically 3 or 4 months of speculation between the election and the budget being held. Some of the big first movements on the winter fuel allowance being cut for most pensioners by making it means tested, and then Labour's first big budget being used to raise taxes, including on national insurance for employers, which wasn't in the manifesto. So that was the sort of mood music which kind of came to sort of, if you like, create the backdrop of Labour's first 4 months in power and really eroded a lot of Labour and Keir Starmer's popularity. Under Burnham, I think they're astutely aware of that. They want big, punter-friendly announcements on the cost of living, and they can include cuts to energy bills, more free bus travel for younger people, and then some more sort of intractable issues that show whose side he's on, like more announcements on devolution.
If we are brutal about it, the reason that Andy Burnham is soon to become Prime Minister is Labour leader and Keir Starmer is not, is that Labour MPs saw the writing on the wall, that at the time of the next election, they were going to get absolutely stuffed and most likely by reform. I mean, what does Andy Burnham bring to the table in the battle against Nigel Farage?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the first rule in politics is learn to count, and usually that's applied through the prism of winning votes in Parliament. A huge set of local elections and national elections in Wales and Scotland, where, frankly, Labour was pretty much trounced and Labour MPs were fearing for their jobs down the line. The biggest threat to them does seem to be reform, where Nigel Farage's Reform UK party is still leading in the opinion polls. It came top in the local elections. It came second in Wales, and did very well in Scotland, where it wouldn't necessarily have been expected to do so. Andy Burnham gave a little bit of a reference to it on Friday in his speech, where he was talking about not out-reforming reform and effectively kind of not making some of the same mistakes in terms of pandering to the right that the Labour government has made. But we have yet to see much of the detail about how he's going to win back these voters. A lot of reform's popularity comes from the fact that they are almost harnessing the sort of same appetite for change that Keir Starmer successfully rode the wave of in 2024. It was a dissatisfaction with the status quo. It was a frustration with kind of political elites. And Keir Starmer was the sort of biggest another get the Tories out candidate. I'm really interested to fast forward about 2 or 3 years to whenever the next general election is and look at how much Andy Burnham can still position himself as the change candidate at the next election, despite potentially having been Prime Minister for longer than Keir Starmer is. He will, by, I think, implementing Labour's 24 manifesto with a few sort of tinges and hints of his own policy, be able to go on a much more bold, ambitious and radical platform that looks at potentially things he's nodded towards in the past, like changing the voting system towards proportional representation. That is something that used to be reform policy. There is not actually a huge amount you need to do in order to sort of signpost to Labour reform-minded voters that to back you and to sort of be on your side.
I'm just wondering, though, I mean, can the King of the North become Prime Minister of the whole country without losing the identity that got him there?
It sort of speaks to what is his identity and how much can it be forged. And there's been a real sort of battle for the soul of Andy Burnham over the last few weeks, where people are starting to worry that Shabana Mahmood being touted for Chancellor means that he is prepared to sort of sacrifice a lot of the principles that they thought that he already held. Now, allies of Burnham say, okay, look, it's just pragmatism and we need somebody that can retain the confidence of the markets. But it's a big test very early on of how much he's committed to stick to his principles. Now, Andy Burnham likes to circumvent the sort of traditional media routes, right? He's been doing a lot of stuff where he's just talking to kind of normal voters and putting it on his Facebook page, where he's doing Instagram Q&As and Reddit Q&As without necessarily having to use the sort of traditional lens of media scrutiny. And that means that he can kind of come across as quite authentic. But he is still avoiding a lot of difficult trade-offs. And I hear a lot from Foreign Office sources about how concerned they are about his first weeks in office, when they think that the war between Iran and the US could significantly escalate. They say, what is Andy Burnham's stance? What are we going to be doing if the US decides to take much greater provocation and start striking civilians in Iran? Andy Burnham is still kind of in the place where he's having his cake and eating it. He's saying he wants to be all things to all people whilst being distinctively Andy Burnham. It's not quite clear what sacrifices he is willing to make. We didn't hear anything in that speech about the realities of the situation he finds himself in, fiscally or politically. He's just kind of driving forward in one direction, but not acknowledging the wider sort of buttresses around him.
And that's a lot for today, indeed for this week on This Is Why, and a busy week it has been as well. Do make sure to scroll back to see if there are any episodes you may have missed, including a catch-up with Michael Clark. We were talking about the renewed conflict between Iran and the United States. If you like what you've heard, do consider giving the podcast a follow, and we are always in the market for suggestions for future topics to cover. why@sky.uk is the email. We're back the other side of the weekend. Till then, take care.